everyone. Thanks for joining another DJ Shan Azure Remix show. We are continuing on in our quest to teach an infrastructure person how to code. I am joined by Matt Canty. How are you doing today, Matt?
I'm great. How are you, Shannon?
Good, good. I swear your hair gets longer each time I see you.
It does.
Thanks for joining us today. I think what we'll start with here is we'll start with a couple of resources. So I'll walk through these really quickly here, and the hope will be to then transition it over to Matt. So let's start with the GitHub Quickstart Template repo. This is a great spot to pull example code from. They have switched it up ever so slightly. This used to have a 101, 201, 301 leveling. It looks like everything now shows up in quick starts. They've organized it based upon the resource provider, which is just essentially the ARM API that gets exposed by way of the Azure Resource Manager portal. So you can build something like a VM and a NIC or a virtual network. So since it's now organized by resource provider, there's a lot of nested folders in here. But when you go in this far, you're starting to see things like 2 VMs and load balancer NAT rules, how to decrypt a VMSS Linux-based deployment, multiple VM load balancer zones, right? So there's a lot of different things to pull from in here. Let's take a look at VM join existing domain. If you click on in here, you start to see this being built. So you can just copy and paste this into whatever you're using for on your local machine, right? So there's a lot of different interesting things here that highlights the ways in which to use the templates. And like I said, it's this repo, right? And we'll link to this in the show notes, going down here into the quick starts, and then everything's divided up now based upon the resource providers. So from there, this is the template structure. It's a very generic format. We've talked about parameters, variables, functions, resource outputs. This sort of starts to dig into it more, right? There's a lot of good links here. So Visual Studio Code with the Azure Resource Manager Tools extension, the different things that are required, right? Content versions required, but like API or parameters aren't. The API profile or parameters or variables, those aren't required. So this is a good base understanding. This obviously links out to additional documentation. These are the best practices. So, you're limited to 256 parameters, 256 variables. That's a lot of parameters and variables, but that's something to pay attention to if you're building really big environments. General recommendations, right? These are great spots to dig into more, thinking about declaring the location this way versus popping it in as a parameter. It's one way to kind of clean up what you're doing, right? So this is another good spot to go to for kind of best practices. And I'm just closing out of each tab as I'm going through it. And like I said, these will all show up in the show notes. This is where you're defining this is the actual ARM template reference. So everything's organized over here on the far left based upon the resource provider. So again, if we wanted to come down to compute, and wanted to extend this out, we wanted to go down to virtual machines, we could click on virtual machines outright, and then here is the JSON kind of bare bones template, right? All the different things that it's looking for or could potentially be looking for. And we'll highlight this as well. The Bicep components are showing up here as well, which is awesome to see. And then you can organize it based upon the different API versions. So this starts to help. Like if you're getting into weird API issues and you need to go back to documentation, this is one of the ones that Matt and I kind of go to pretty often if we're running into weird nuances. This is the actual URL for parameters, right? So the minimal declaration, secure parameters, allowed values, default value. Then you've got your variables over here. Shows how to define the variable, what it's looking for, how to use the variable, an example template. The resources here I won't go into it too much, but this is where it starts. And it shows how to create a child resource name and type, conditional deployment, resource dependencies. These are all sort of advanced functions related to resource declaration. But this sort of starts in on how to do that. And then these are the outputs, right? So if you wanted to have something like a public IP show up in your output, if you're building something like a site-to-site VPN and you don't have to go into the portal after it builds, but you need to know the actual IP address to initiate the site-to-site VPN connection, that would showcase the showcase there in terms of the output. This is a very great book that I've read through. I didn't go as deep as I probably could have, but this is a really good resource, as is this book. It's a packed book. So we'll link to this in the show notes. This, when I had a Pluralsight license, I don't have one anymore. So if you have a Pluralsight license, it's a little older. So it was created in 2017. I almost said 2007. 2017, 10 years after 2007. And it's one of those things where this starts to help you out with nested deployments, deploying a simple PaaS solution, right? Parameters, variables, and resources. This was a course I took back in 2017, actually, when it came out, just to get a handle on how to build an ARM template. So, I mean, it's a little older, so it may not be as relevant these days, especially given the fact that Bicep's gaining momentum, but it's something just to pay attention to, especially if you get that Pluralsight license. I think this is essentially where the best practices come from. This was an Azure CAP publication that came out in 2015, right? So considerations and proven practices for ARM templates. I believe that's what the ARM templates best practices has evolved into. We'll link to this. You can read through it if you've got time and you're curious as to some of the history here, but this is more so talking about the considerations, t-shirt sizes, accessing the environment with RBAC provision, right? Those types of things. And then this is the last GitHub repo that I'll reference, and then I will turn this over to Matt, who's going to go dig into this a little bit more. But this is a fantastic repo that a teammate of mine put together. It's learning ARM, right? And so each one of these, let's say we wanted to start with just the first folder here. So demystifying ARM templates, it's an introduction to ARM templates. There is an actual video, which is awesome. Then it kind of explains what we've gone through a little bit. So I often think everybody learns a little bit differently. So we want to try and give you enough resources, pick whatever makes the most sense. If leaning on these videos are doing it, awesome, we've done our good part here. But I never want to leave you without info to go dig into deeper in the event that you need to. So these are all kind of what I've got in terms of references. And what I'm going to do now is I am going to flip this over to Matt. So Matt,
Yep.
let's take it from there.
Yeah, and so one of the things I wanted to point out about the reference that Shannon had previously showed here, the ARM reference, is you're going to run into things like if you're trying to provision something that you've never provisioned before, say a Cosmos DB account, right? And you're going to run into some properties that are required, things like what kind is the database supposed to be, and so you'll find, like if it's an enum, there's certain values that are going to be accepted here, and then this will give you the list of values that you can use, right? If you don't know what string to put into, say, that property or whatever. So I actually frequent this references a lot just because of things like that. Like if I'm working on an architecture that has some technology that I haven't used for a while, or I'm not familiar with, what all properties and things like that need to be set on that piece of infrastructure, then I'll come in here and, figure out on those enums, especially like what do I put in there for what kind of Cosmos DB is this, and what that equates to being created in the background. So this is one that I frequent a lot, that Shannon did mention. I also like to use this tool called Azure Resource Explorer. And if you've opened up your portal, your Azure portal, and then you click on, or you open up another tab after you've already been authenticated, then this will authenticate you automatically when you put in https://resources.azure.com, and then it'll populate with all of your subscriptions that you have access to and things like that. And inside that, you can see here, I'm in my subscription here, and you'll see you can go by different providers, like what resource providers do I have in my subscription. What I like to do is on a resource group that I've already built. If I want to create an architecture or something, I may deploy that in Azure with a point and click that you get out of the portal, or I'll just create a resource group from that, and then my page isn't responding.
Oh no! There we go.
It is.
Just say wait. There you go.
I'm not back in 5 minutes.
It's live.
So you'll see the resource groups that I have here are listed, and if I click on one of those resource groups, it'll show you the resources that are there, and you can see the JSON, for the resources. Or you can go by provider again here and say, okay, I know I have a storage account or something in here, and I can look and see what does that storage account look like in JSON format. And one of the other things that I like about this is they have some documentation on, like, what does this stuff mean, right? So what is the JSON property encryption services queue last enable time, right? And so some of this stuff will be documented in here. Of course, if you don't find it here, go back to that references documentation that we pointed to before. But you also can see the actions that are happening, and you'll notice up here that the delete action is a delete call to the API. So you have a REST call of type delete, and then it gives you the URL that you would use to delete that specific resource. If you're trying to do this, say with code, right? So I wanted to maybe call the API to delete my resource, or get this service SaaS list, right? So they have these API calls that you can look at as well. There's some stuff in here for Ansible, what this would look like in Ansible as well. So various things that you can get just from this resources.azure.com.
And we covered a little bit of that during our last session, but I feel like this is a little bit more of a deeper dive. So Matt, real quick, before we go into what we have planned to show today, I wanted to know if you wanted to explain a little bit of what enum means, because I feel like that's something that might be a little bit of a curious thing for folks that are trying to understand this a little bit better.
Yeah, so enum is basically an enumeration, which is in developer terms, this is a way that I can set a list of options for people to choose from, and that's the list of options that are available to accept. It's a little bit easier to if you're using code like in C# or something like that, because you'll have an enum, and you could say something like kind dot, and then it would list the available options for kind. Whereas with ARM templates, it's just expecting a string, and you're supposed to know what that string is. So it's just an enumeration, which is a list of available options that you can choose for that specific property that it's asking for.
Okay. Yeah, because I feel like, and I even said it was enum for enumerate. I feel like some of these terms are a little bit harder to grasp. I also wanted to have you explain real quick, because I don't think it needs to be a very massive thing. Post, delete, get real quick, like when we're talking about what that's doing, because I feel like that's also important. Even though ARM templates are a crazy thing to get your hand around, or get your arms around, maybe it could be your hand. Maybe understanding what is actually happening might make a little bit of sense here too.
Yeah, so actually when you are using ARM templates, you are basically you're calling the APIs in the background. Now what happens is there is this template execution engine that accepts your template, validates that, and then calls the different resource providers and the different methods that they have on those APIs. So what this is an API call. And when you make an API call, you make an API call with using an HTTP method. And so if you're familiar with like web pages and doing a post on a web page, that would be something that makes a change, based on the method, you're making a change to the data using the API. So you'll see the different methods that are being called, or the different it's the type of HTTP call that you're making. So when you just go and visit a web page, right? If I open my browser and I go to www.bing.com, I'm making a GET call on the API for Bing. Basically, is saying this is an HTTP GET request. And GET requests just are to go out to a resource and grab the information about that resource and bring it back. And then your web page transforms all of the data that is getting into HTML, and makes it pretty with pictures and things like that. When you do a post request, you provide data, and it's saying, okay, well, this is the data that I'm changing or adding. I'm adding a resource. I'm going to post it to the API, and then that API knows that, hey, this is a call to change data. And so the web developers who are developing properly will require a different verb for whether you're doing a delete, a post. There's patch, which is if you're like changing just a piece of data within a resource. And then of course get, so you can read the data from the resource. So it's really about making a call to the API, and that API sits on a resource endpoint, which is right here, right? And so this is the URL is just actually going to a resource, and that resource happens to be management.azure.com, which is the API. And then it's breaking it down into, okay, I want to get subscriptions, and I want to get this specific subscription. And I want to, from that subscription, I'm going to go to resource groups endpoint, and I'm going to grab this specific resource group. And then the providers that I want to manipulate are Microsoft.storage, and then storage accounts is the resource out of that provider that I'm looking for. And then this is the specific storage account resource. And then this is the API version that I want to call. And then I'm doing a post to that. So I'm saying I am deleting, or this is a delete verb here. I am deleting the resource at this URL.
Yeah, and I think once we started playing around with this, and at some point we'll go into Postman, we'll kind of talk a little bit about what that can do. It sort of blew my mind that everything you're doing, doesn't matter if it's PowerShell, the AZ CLI, ARM templates, Bicep, even Terraform, you're making API calls the entire time. And it's a weird thing to think about, because it's kind of a little foreign, especially from somebody who's coming from like an infrastructure background,
Right, yeah. And API calls, I mean, APIs are probably one of the greatest things since sliced bread, right? Because it's a way for you to expose a remote resource that somebody can manipulate, from a remote location. So these allow you to manipulate these resources that are sitting out here in Azure. You can manipulate them by passing in a body, which is, this JSON is the body of the request, and then you're posting this body to this URL, and that URL specifically is pointing to what resource you want to modify. And then the body is, here's how I want to modify it. And so it really is, I could take this call and I could put it in PowerShell and, just make this call right to the API if I wanted to. Otherwise, when you're using a PowerShell command, when you're using the portal, when you're using ARM, it's just that same API is wrapped with an easier to use type of interface, right? So it really is all about the API, and that's why this reference documentation is so important too, is because this is what the API is expecting for values on properties. Otherwise, if you don't get some of this right, you're going to get errors back, and you're going to get frustrated and just give up altogether.
Right. Well, Matt, I think now is a good time to maybe start digging into an actual example template. What do you think?
Sure, yeah. Yes, we can do that. So I did take one of the templates that Shannon had pointed out, the Quickstart reference, and I grabbed this template. It is just the VNet with two nets. It's the 101 template. And I downloaded those files from GitHub. Let me... So here's how I get to the Azure Quickstart templates. I just go to GitHub, I type in Azure Quickstart, And this very first one that comes up is that repository that Shannon showed. And I went into the quick starts. And of course, we're dealing with networking, so it's Microsoft.network. That's the resource provider that we want here. And then I just picked a simple, like a 101 Azure virtual network with 2 subnets right here. So then I went in and I just grabbed the raw files. If you look at raw here, you can just do the copy all this down to here, copy all of that, and I pasted it into Visual Studio Code, right? And so I grabbed that, and then I just created a blank parameter file, and I'll show you how to use snippets in order to do stuff like that as well. But this is the file, and it basically has, you know, our parameters that are defined, and then it has variables, it has resources. And one of the things that I like to use, and I think I mentioned this during one of the last videos, is the extensions in Visual Studio Code. If you look at Visual Studio Code extensions, they have Azure Resource Manager extensions. And that gives you some of this fun stuff like this ARM template outline. So without this, you are looking at basically your folder structure and a bunch of lines of code. And what this ARM template outline does is it parses this JSON to show you the different sections that you have here. Like, so I have my resources section, my virtual network right here. So I can click in between these and it will take me, highlight the code for this parameter or this VNet resource. See how it highlights all of that code. So that's an easier way to navigate, especially when you get into these templates that are hundreds of lines long with multiple resources in it, and you're looking, okay, there's my VM, there's my load balancer, there's my VNet, there's the NIC, you know, you can easily see that over here under resources instead of having to search through and say, okay, where does this bracket that starts my VM start at, so that I can find my code. So this is a great extension to have to help kind of navigate your code.
And it'll also highlight if you're missing something. So for me, when I first started playing around with JSON, I'd inevitably miss a comma, right? Like you always have to have a comma on the last thing before the next piece. And maybe I said it wrong, but that's the way I think of it, right? And sometimes I'd miss a comma, or I'd have an extra comma. And the linter for the Azure Resource Manager inside of Visual Studio Code is really helpful in pointing out what needs to be changed and why.
Yeah, you have a couple of ways that happens too. You can look over here on the top right hand side, and it has kind of a smaller thumbnail of what the whole code looks like, and you can look for these areas where there's some red highlighting or green highlighting or yellow highlighting, and it will tell you where something's wrong. So you click. See, if I click up here, I can navigate through this thing. So I can just go and click here where the red is, or you can see here in your scroll bar as well. That there's a little red tick right there, and that will bring me to the section of code where the error is, and then you can kind of see there's an underline there, there's an underline there, and that's just denoting, hey, there's an error here, and it needs to be taken care of, and so you fix the syntax error, you know, by adding your comma or whatever.
Yeah, very cool. So I think this template has a lot of default values, right, Matt?
Yeah, so if you look at the template, you'll see every parameter in this template has a default value. So in essence, I don't necessarily need a parameter file. So I have a parameter file here that I just created, a blank one, and it doesn't have any parameters in it. And this template will deploy with no parameter added to it. You don't have to add it, but you can override. So if I were to just deploy this template as is, right, I have a VNet name parameter here, and you can see it's called VNet1 by default. So they've added a default value. If I were to take this value out and not provide the parameter in the parameter file, I would get an error, and I'll show that. But if you go down to your resource, you can see where that parameter is being used. So it's saying, okay, here's my VNet resource, and the name of my VNet, I'm going to go up to, so these square brackets right here are a little token that says, okay, I'm going to use some sort of magic here, whether it's a function, whether it's calling a parameter or a variable or something. It denotes, hey, this is a token for looking somewhere else, right? And so it's saying, look at parameters and find VNet name in those parameters, which is what this is called right here. And it's going to inject that value into where this token is at. So anywhere that I have this parameters VNet name token, it's going to receive the same value. So when you go to use variables and parameters, and I think I mentioned this in the previous video as well, is when you go to use these things, if you're supplying this same value in more than one place, and there's a chance you're going to want to change that later, at least use a variable for it, if not a parameter. If it's something that changes during, that you want the person running the template to be able to change or to supply as they're running it, then you use parameters. But that just makes it so that it's easier to modify this template, because you can see there's references to VNet name here. And if I were to create a nick for a VM, that nick has a place in it for what VNet do you want to add this to. And instead of changing the name of my VNet and then going down here and changing the VNet down here and changing it in the nick to say, okay, I wanted to change it to something else, I'm just going to point to that parameter.
Yeah, and it takes away the guesswork. It takes away the possibility for an error in deployment. All of a sudden, you have multiple VNets versus one VNet, or multiple NICs versus one NIC. This sort of helps organize the flow of the ARM template.
Right. And yeah, and so this one, you can see they used parameters for the VNet name, for the address prefix, which in networking terms is basically the address range that the VNet is going to take. And then they have a subnet prefix. So out of that address prefix from the VNet, this is what I'm going to give to my subnet 1 is going to get, and this is for infrastructure folks. Hopefully you understand a little bit about networking, but you can see I've taken the 16 mask and I've used the 0.0.0 address space 24, which means, use these bits for the network mask, and then these bits are for the machines that I'm adding. It's gonna get these bits, right? And then so you see subnet prefix 1 is going to be the 0 address space at the 24th bit. Subnet prefix 2 is going to be the 1 space at the 24th bit, and so this one only has 2 subnets, but you can see there's a lot of address space left that can be used. So those parameters are being provided here for the subnets, right? We have our subnet 2 name, our subnet 2 prefix down here, subnet 1 prefix, subnet 1 name up here. So those are being supplied as parameters. So I can change these things. I don't have to change them here in the default value in the template. I don't have to touch the template to change what address space my VNet is going to get or my subnets are going to get. I can just supply a parameter that says, hey, give the VNet this address space instead, and give the subnets this address space instead. So overriding what the default value is.
There's a really cool bit here that depends on. So the subnet depends on the VNet to be there.
Yes.
You want to talk about that real quick? Because I feel like that's kind of some cool flow. Because we've talked about the flow. We've talked about the fact that, declarative templates, you don't care as much about the end state. You want a virtual network, but sometimes resources require other resources to be there first. So do you want to talk a little bit about the depends on?
Yeah, so depends on is used as a way for you to tell the template execution engine that, hey, in order for this resource to be created, it depends on another resource being there first.
Right.
So I can specify my resources in whatever order I want to under resources right here. I could put a VM above this and say, and put a NIC in there as well and say, oh, by the way, this NIC depends on something called parameters VNet 1. It's going to go look at, say the VNet, parameters VNet name. It's going to look up here and say, oh, VNet name is VNet 1. So in my depends on of my NIC, it's going to say, this NIC depends on VNet 1 being there, and it's not there yet. So it gives the template execution engine an order of operations for creating things. If something does not have a depends on listed in here, then the template execution engine is going to try to create all of those things in parallel right there at the get-go. So you can imagine trying to create a NIC when there is no VNet to put it on, and that you're going to have a failure because it's going to try to create the NIC at the same time the VNet is creating. It's not going to be there yet, and the NIC is going to come back and say, hey, I can't.
Or the VM, right? The VM will fail if the VM requires a NIC and there's no depends on. The VM will error out.
Exactly. But if you even go a level deeper into more of a workload, what you can do is if you're deploying multiple VMs and say you've got SQL, you've got a web server, you've got Active Directory boxes that you are deploying, of course, your web server has to be added to the domain. Your SQL box has to be added to the domain. You can put the depends on in those machines to say, hey, these machines are going to be domain joined, so we have to make sure that the domain controller is there first. So put the depends on for your domain controller in there in your SQL box or your web box, and the template execution will see that and will say, oh, I can't create these web and data VMs yet because Active Directory hasn't finished provision, right? My machines aren't there.
Yeah, very cool. Well, how about this? Do you want to try taking one of the default values out and then showing us how to run it via PowerShell?
Let's do this. Let's run it as is.
Okay, I'm good with that.
Yep, let's deploy it as is and show that it gets created. So just so that folks can see, I've got a VNet deploy resource group here that is empty, and I will refresh just to show you that it is indeed empty. And we will go back here and we are just going to deploy our template. Now we deploy this, you can upload them into the portal and deploy them that way, or I like to use PowerShell to deploy. And so the first thing that you have to do, which I've already done, is login-az account. I've already done that, so I'm gonna skip over that, but that's gonna bring up a window to prompt you to log into your work account for the Azure portal, and then it'll come back to this window, and then you'll be logged in. So it will show things like what subscriptions that you have, Azure. So see, I did it here, and it shows you what your default subscription is and things like that. So once that's done, then we're going to create a new AZ resource group deployment. Okay, and
Tab complete's your friend, right, Matt?
Yes, I love tab complete. Unfortunately, if you type new AZ and then you start to tab, you're going to have a lot of stuff to tab. So we're wanting to do a resource group deployment. Now, there's other deployments that you can do. You can actually do a deployment to a subscription and things like that. We're targeting a resource group, so we're going to put new AZ resource group deployment, and then we're going to tab complete our options that we need to provide. We have a name. We have to name our deployment. This is not going to name the resource group or anything like that. This is just going to name the deployment. So if you're doing multiple deployments because one, the first try failed or whatever, you would iterate these, right? Like deployment 1, deployment 2, 3, or whatever, or use date and time. That's I like to use the date and time down to the second, just because that will iterate and iterate and iterate and iterate, and you don't have to worry about it ever again. You can just use a variable for that.
Right.
But I'm just gonna put this in VNet deploy 1. So then you have resource group name. What resource group do I want to deploy this to? And I think I called it VNet deploy. Let's just double check that. Yeah, VNet deploy. So it has to know what resource group that you want to. There's a mode. The options for mode are complete, incremental. I think those are the only two options. Yeah, it's complete and incremental. A little bit of explanation on that is that a complete deployment will look at the resource group, it will look at the ARM template, and it will make them match. So if there are existing resources in that resource group and you choose complete, it will delete the resources that are in there. So be very careful. I always use incremental, and it's the default mode. So I don't even put the parameter. So unless you really want to delete resources, I just leave mode off. And then deployment debug log level you can use. It's just an optional. Rollback to latest deployment or last deployment, that's optional. Rollback deployment name is optional. Tag optional. What if result format is optional. The thing that I'm looking for here is going to be the template file. So there's a parameter object, there's a parameter file, but I want template file right there. And that is going to be // because of the folder that I'm in, this Azure deploy.json right here. It's this file that I want, which is the one that I've been editing. So that's the template file. And we'll just go ahead and try deploying it with that.
Oh, I didn't know if you wanted to add verbose on. We can add that for the next one.
Yeah, we can add verbose on. That gives you the kind of the what's going on behind the scenes, like the debug log or whatever.
Yeah, I often find that helpful if I'm deploying something pretty large.
Yeah, and this isn't much of a deployment, and you can see, oh, it's done, right? You can see here it did it. If I go back into my resource group and I refresh,
it takes a little bit of time.
Yeah. Let me go to deployments. Maybe we'll see it there.
Yep, it succeeded.
Yep. And that was, yep, just a couple minutes ago. And you can see in here when you actually look at the deployment details, you can see what was deployed. VNet 1 was deployed okay. VNet 1 subnet 1 was okay, and VNet 2 subnet 2 is okay.
Right.
And those are named, of course, based off of the defaults. So that's the template just deploys perfectly fine. And the reason why I didn't provide a parameter file is because it has all of those default values in there, right? So let's go back in here.
There it is.
There it is, and let's wipe it out.
Oh yeah, we had to blow this up.
Yeah, make it
so that everybody can see everything. But yeah, delete would show up there if you were.
Yeah, it shows up on
higher resolution.
So I got my little notification up here that it is executing. And so while
the delete functionality, this is hitting another REST API, deleting the resource.
Yep. While that's going on, I'm just going to remove one of the parameters.
Okay.
One of the default values from the parameters. So let's go here, and I don't want to mess with the prefix. Let's just do the name. And I'm just going to wipe out the default value. So now this is not going to provide the template itself is not going to find a default value. And notice how Visual Studio Code, my extension says, hey, there's no value found. I'm using this parameter file as my parameter file for this deployment, and there's no value in there, and there's no default value, right? See, this one says I'm using the default value with these nice little prompts to show you what it's using. So if I just
and I think the thing we want to call it here is in the event you miss some of these, right? Because I think a lot of us get very deep into what we're doing, we might miss certain things. So showing where it or calling out where it shows up is great. But if you miss it, I think trying to troubleshoot it is almost as invaluable as learning how to build ARM templates, right?
Right. So I'm gonna go ahead and iterate my deployment name, and you'll see that show up in there. And I'm not going to provide a parameter value, and I'm going to go ahead and hit enter.
I didn't know if you wanted to add verbose now, because sometimes.
Oh yeah, like I should have done that.
Well, you'll still get an error, I think, right?
No, because my file changed but didn't get saved.
Oh.
All right, let's save that, and we'll have to go delete.
Y'all, this is recorded live. It's not live, but this is recorded live.
Yeah, that's what happens.
That's all right.
All right, refresh this guy. Dismiss this. Redelete this again. All right.
And I think if you're watching this and you're getting anything, experiment, because you'll find your own flow and you'll find a way to, and don't be afraid of these error messages, right?
No, yeah, and then this is live. This is me in real life. I am not perfect, and I iterate when I go to deploy something. If I'm building a big, huge, complex architecture, I'll build it piece by piece, try to test it in between pieces, so I know that if I mess something up, I know almost where I messed it up. I don't have to go through hundreds of lines of code. So there's your verbose flag. Let me make sure that the VNet is done deleting. Okay, it is finished. So we're going to go ahead and see now it's asking me for a value. So it can't find a parameter to bind to the value VNet name, and it's because it's an empty string, and so there my deployment fails.
Well, it doesn't even process, right? It stops before, yeah.
And notice how cool this stuff is as well. It knows that I'm using this parameter file as my parameter file. So it pulls up, hey, what parameter do you want to add? So here I can just say,
yeah, and those to-dos are helping. This is the the Azure Resource Manager tool, right? That's what this extension is. Isn't that what they? Okay.
Yeah. Yep. So now when I do this,
did you save it?
I did. Now when I do this, I'm going to provide a template parameter, not object, but file. And that's going to be my /Azure deploy.parameters.json file. And I'm going to notice the verbosity now. It shows you, hey, it's valid. It's creating the deployment. It's going to check it, and it'll show you it's checking every so often until it's finished deploying.
Yeah, I like the verbose flag for larger templates where, especially if something's reliant upon something else, or you just get errors, right? It's nice to sometimes see it here first. You can always dig into the activity log. That's where you'll get the raw JSON, and you'll try to figure out exactly what went wrong. But this sometimes clues you into the error in the ARM template.
Yep. Yeah, and so a couple things that you'll notice here. Let me go over to the portal while that's happening. Is I forgot to rename my deployment after it succeeded the last time, but each deployment that you do to this resource group that has a different name is going to show up in here.
Yeah.
And then you can click on that and see the details.
And that's helpful too in the event something fails, right? So even failures will show up here.
Yes, and then you can dig into those failures, right? Like there might be an instance where you provision a dependency, but that dependency might be the wrong kind, right? Or something like that, and you're trying to pass some values into another resource that's going to consume that dependency, and it fails because, hey, this isn't the right kind or whatever. And this is a really helpful way of troubleshooting those error messages.
Yeah. Did it finish?
It did.
Very cool. So everything should now show up in that resource group.
Yep, everything will show up in the resource group, and there's my VNet, and there's the address space. Here's my subnets and their address space. And notice I have a lot more that I can add, a lot more space to use there because I use such a big address.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool. Well, I think that kind of takes us to the end of our session today. We have gone through with some spots to get better, to dig deeper, so you're never starting from scratch. I think that's the big thing. You don't have to start from scratch unless you absolutely want to, but I think most people don't. Then you've got some familiarity now with pulling in an ARM template from the quick starts, running it as is, handling, putting that parameter into the parameters file, leaning on PowerShell. Lots of goodness today. So I think what we ask is just stay tuned. We've got some more coming. Matt's going to go on vacation. Shame on him. I'm just kidding. We're supposed to do that, right? It's the summertime. Your kids are off of school. Why not? So there will be a little bit of a break here, but we'll have some other good content in short order. And yeah, so stay tuned. Thanks for joining, Matt. I definitely appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And this is another DJ Shan Azure remix. That's a wrap.